The $4,500 check my half-sister Valerie mailed me had the word platen typed in the memo line, as if she were paying me for a rubber roller instead of liquidating my entire retirement. She thought I would cash it and slink away, maybe buy myself a sad little consolation prize, and keep my mouth shut. She did not know that the 1920s Royal typewriter I had kept in my shop, the one she called scrap metal and left by the dumpster like a piece of broken furniture, had a false bottom under its carriage. Inside that hollow base was the original partnership agreement, 9 pages of it, with a note in our late father's handwriting that said do not trust them. That single piece of paper would void her $610,000 sale to a film studio prop house, expose a forged dissolution, a dead notary stamp, and a Belizean shell account. Before the year ended, Valerie would be polishing key levers in a smock that said shifted my pension, while every repair ticket she initialed printed her fraud docket number. I am going to tell you exactly how it happened, step by step, because the details are the whole story. I am 57 years old. For 28 years I worked as a legal secretary at a mid-sized civil litigation firm in Columbus, Ohio. Not a paralegal, not an office manager, a legal secretary. That means I spent almost 3 decades reading contracts line by line, catching mistakes that young associates made at 2 a.m, cross-referencing exhibits, and understanding exactly what a notary block meant. I knew where to look for cross-out clauses, schedule addendums, and conditional releases. I typed enough settlement agreements to know that the devil does not live in the big paragraphs. He lives in the footnotes, in the commas, in the space between the signature line and the date. I also knew how to keep my face still when someone lied to me in a conference room. That skill would save me later. When I cashed out my $139,000 401k to open a vintage typewriter restoration and custom typewriter paper shop, I told myself I was finally building something of my own. That money was not a windfall. It was 30 years of early mornings, brown bag lunches, and wearing the same 2-quart suits until the lining frayed. I had dreamed about typewriters since I was a girl. My father was a retired notary public, but before that he had been a mechanical repairman, and he spent every other weekend teaching me how to replace a drawband, polish a key lever, and tune a carriage return until it moved like a well-oiled hinge. He used to say a typewriter never lies. You can look at the alignment of the type bars and know exactly how the machine has been treated. I believed him. My half-sister Valerie was 8 years younger than me, the daughter of my father's second marriage. She had the marketing smile, the Instagram contacts, and a way of walking into a room like she was doing everyone a favor just by existing. She had never kept a job longer than 18 months, but she had a list of collectors and film studios who she swore would pay top dollar for restored machines. I should have asked more questions. I did not, because I wanted to believe that blood meant something, and because I was tired of drafting other people's settlement agreements while my own life sat idle. Our father insisted on notarizing the partnership agreement himself. He drove to the shop on a Thursday afternoon, sat at the front counter with his brass notary seal and watched us sign all 9 pages. He was quiet that day, quieter than usual. He said keep the original somewhere safe, not in the shop, not in a file cabinet. I asked him why. He just said trust an old man's instincts. 6 days later he died. A stroke, the coroner said, quick and merciful. I found out later that he had spent the morning of his death on the phone with a bank compliance officer, setting something in motion that neither Valerie nor I knew about. My husband David, a quiet architect I had been married to for 22 years, said only one thing when I told him about going into business with Valerie. You cannot restore a person who has never once been honest. He was right, and I should have listened. But I was drowning in grief and optimism, and I told myself he was being cynical. David died 3 years before all of this, which is its own kind of wound. But the one useful thing he left me was that sentence. It played on a loop in my head while I lay on the floor of Valerie's kitchen pretending to have a heart attack. But I am getting ahead of myself. We rented a small storefront on High Street, near the old German village end, with a tin ceiling and a front window that caught the afternoon light. We painted the shelves a deep forest green, filled the front room with restored machines, a 1920s Corona folding portable with gold decals, a battleship grey Remington Standard, a bright red Royal Quiet Deluxe, and a black Underwood No. 5 that I rebuilt from a basket case. We sold custom typewriter paper, cotton rag and linen stock with a tooth that held ink beautifully. I also agreed to maintain the typewriters for my church's community newsletter. That meant I had a set of keys to the church basement and a long wooden bench by the boiler, next to a shelf of old hymnals and a box of Advent candles. That detail matters because the church basement is where I eventually hid the only piece of evidence that saved me. I want you to remember that bench because it becomes important. 18 months after we opened, the shop was doing well enough that a film studio prop house in Los Angeles reached out. They wanted a bulk purchase. I was at the church repairing an old Underwood when Valerie called me, her voice high and tight with excitement. She said the buyers wanted a clean title, no loose ends, and they were offering $610,000 for our restored 1920s Corona and Remington machines, plus the client list. The client list was the real asset, and I knew it. 347 names, collectors, set decorators, vintage shop buyers, and film property masters. You cannot rebuild that list by posting on social media. Valerie knew it too. I told her we owned the business 50-50 and everything was already clean. She said she would handle the paperwork. That was my mistake, or maybe it was my test. 3 days later I went to the shop and found the door locked, the lights off, and a cashier's check taped to the glass. The check was made out to me for $4,500. In the memo line, typed in capital letters, was the word platen. A platen is the rubber roller on a typewriter, the part that wears out and gets replaced every few years. She was paying me off with the cost of a spare part. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, holding that check, looking at the darkened shop, and I realized the new deadbolt on the front door was not one I had installed. I called Valerie. She did not answer. She texted me a PDF of a document titled Mutual Dissolution of Partnership. It had my signature on it. I recognized the signature immediately as a forgery because my capital R always has a flat top, like a table, and this one had a rounded top, like a candy cane. The document said I had agreed to accept $4,500 for my interest in the remaining platen inventory and had resigned from the business. The client list, the restored machines, the intellectual property, all of it had been sold by Valerie as sole owner, effective 3 days earlier. I enlarged the image on my phone. The notary stamp on the final page was from an Ohio notary I did not recognize. The date was the day before our father died. I stood on the sidewalk outside my own locked shop and felt the world tilt, like someone had lifted one side of the street. Within a day, Valerie and her husband Mark arrived at my front porch. Valerie was wearing a cream cashmere wrap and carrying a clipboard. Mark was on his phone, talking loudly about wire transfers and closing conditions. They did not ask if I was okay. They did not mention our father, who had been dead for only a week and a half. Valerie hugged me and said she was taking care of me, that I was obviously not thinking clearly, and that I should come stay at their house for a while. Mark kept calling me champ, which he had never called me before in his life. They walked through my living room and started pointing at things. Valerie picked up the old 1920s Royal typewriter from the console table by the window. It was the machine our father had given me for my 40th birthday, a heavy black Royal flatbed with gold pinstriping and a carriage return lever that clicked like a vault door. She said, "This old junk is just taking up space," and she carried it out to the curb. Mark said, "We can get you a new one, something lighter." I watched them throw my father's typewriter onto the pile of trash bags next to the recycling bin. The sound it made when it hit the concrete, a dull metal thud, went through me like a bell. That was the moment I stopped being their sister and started being their secretary again, quiet and invisible. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just watched. After they left, I went out to the curb in the dark. The street light at the corner of my street flickered, and I could hear a dog barking 2 houses down. I lifted the Royal back into my arms. It weighed 30 pounds, solid cast iron, and the cold of the evening had already seeped into the metal. I carried it inside and set it on my kitchen table, and that was when I noticed the base plate had a small scratch near one of the screws, and the bottom did not sit flush. A normal person would have ignored it. I am not a normal person. I have rebuilt over 200 typewriters, and I know when a machine's base has been opened and refitted. I unscrewed the 4 brass feet. Under the felt base there was a second panel, a thin piece of wood with a finger notch cut into the edge. I lifted it out. Flat against the wood in a space hollowed out and lined with wax paper was a thin manila envelope. Inside the envelope was our original partnership agreement, all 9 pages, with our father's notary seal on the last page. And on the last page under the notary block, in his precise draftsman's handwriting, he had written, "Do not trust them. The dissolution is a forgery. The real asset is the client list. Save yourself." I sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, reading and rereading the document, holding it under the lamp, checking the notary stamp, running my finger over the raised seal. He had hidden it in the one machine Valerie would throw away, because she had never once valued the kind of thing he and I valued. She saw an old typewriter. He saw a vault. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family should not be allowed to forge your name just because they share your blood. Now, let me tell you how they tried to bury me, and how I made sure they could not. Valerie and Mark moved me into their finished basement that week. They called it a guest suite. It had a pull-out couch, a mini fridge, a small bathroom with a shower stall, and a security camera in the corner pointed at the door. They said the camera was for package deliveries. I knew it was for me. They took my phone charger, offered to update my phone, and when I said no, Valerie looked at Mark in a way that made my stomach drop. I smiled and said I was tired, so tired, and I let my hands tremble a little more than they needed to. I have spent my entire adult life watching attorneys use confusion as a shield, and I know how to play foggy. I repeated that I just needed to rest. I did not mention the royal, which I had already hidden in the church basement under a tarp behind the boiler, wrapped in an old drop cloth and tucked between the wall and a stack of wooden pews. The only people who had keys to that basement were the church secretary and me, and I had been fixing their typewriters for free for over a year. They trusted me. Every morning Valerie slid a new stack of papers across the kitchen island, a durable power of attorney, a release of claims, a new operating agreement that gave her sole control, a deed transfer for the shop lease, a medical records authorization, a spousal consent form she said David needed to sign even though he was not involved in the business and had been dead for 3 years. She did not know I had not mentioned that to her, which meant she had not done even basic homework. She said it was all standard, just taking care of me. Mark stood behind her, arms crossed, saying, "We don't want you to worry about anything." I would put on my reading glasses, turn the pages slowly, and say I needed a few days to process. I told them I had not slept, that my memory was fuzzy. I deliberately called the prop house the movie people and asked if they made horror films. Valerie rolled her eyes so hard I thought she might strain something. I kept a small voice recorder in my cardigan pocket, a Sony ICD, and I recorded everything. Every conversation about the sale, every time Mark whispered about moving funds, every time Valerie said she was just trying to help. I knew from 2 decades of legal memos that a durable power of attorney signed under pressure could be voided, but they did not know I knew that. I played along. I let them believe I was broken, foggy, passive. The more helpless I seemed, the less they watched me. I also noticed that the security camera in the basement only recorded when the door opened, not the whole room. They wanted to know when I left, not what I did inside. That was a mistake. The house was a 4-bedroom colonial in a gated subdivision, the kind with a 3-car garage and a kitchen island the size of our old shop counter. Valerie and Mark spent money like it was water, and they started spending it immediately. 2 days after I moved in, a furniture delivery truck arrived with a pair of velvet armchairs that had to cost $6,000. I typed in the maker's name on my phone later and found the price. Mark bought an Omega Seamaster watch and left the receipt on the counter. Valerie ordered a new Range Rover online while I sat at the breakfast table eating oatmeal. They were burning through the sale proceeds fast, and that was my first red flag. People who have real money do not spend it all at once. People who are about to lose access to money do. The second red flag was the phone calls. Valerie would step into the office and close the door, but I could hear her voice through the vent in the basement ceiling. She was arguing with someone about a wire transfer that did not clear, about a buyer who wanted proof of clear title, about a compliance hold she did not understand. Mark kept saying, we need to move it now, like a man trying to outrun an audit. I heard the word escrow at least 6 times in one afternoon. That told me the bank had flagged something. I did not know yet that my father had already triggered a hold, but I knew the sale was not settling the way they wanted. That made them more desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. On day 6, the garbage disposal jammed. Mark stood at the sink flipping the switch and cursing. The motor hummed but the blades would not turn. Valerie was on the couch scrolling through her phone, ignoring him. They called a plumber. I watched them wait 3 hours while the sink filled with grey water. Finally, I asked for a pair of needle nose pliers and a hex wrench. I got down on the floor, unplugged the unit, reached into the drain and pulled out a small piece of broken wine glass. Then I reset the overload button on the bottom of the disposal. It took 8 minutes. Mark stared at me like I had performed open-heart surgery. That is when I understood how little they actually knew about running anything. Their entire fortune had been built on my machine restoration skills and my signed documents, and they could not even fix a kitchen sink. I was a woman who had rebuilt 200 typewriters by hand, who could reseat a drawband blind, who could solder a broken type bar under a work lamp, and they thought I was just a foggy old widow who needed to rest. I used the time they were distracted to search the office. The filing cabinet was locked, a basic Han 2 drawer, and I remembered my father teaching me to pick the lock on an old typewriter case with a bent feeler gauge. A typewriter case lock has the same wafer mechanism as a cheap filing cabinet. I took a bobby pin and a small flathead screwdriver from my purse, raked the pins for 30 seconds, and the lock turned. The drawer slid open. Inside, I found the original red folder from the prop house sale. It contained the forged dissolution, the wire transfer instructions, and a loan application. The loan application was in my name alone, dated 3 weeks earlier, for $220,000, secured by my half of the shop. My signature was again wrong, but this time they had also used a notary stamp from a woman who, I knew from the Ohio Secretary of State website, had died 5 years ago. They had not even checked. That was their mistake. In the back of the drawer was a deposit slip for an account at a bank in Belize, payable to an LLC called Vantage Type Holdings. The account had received $190,000 of the prop house money. The rest had gone to a credit card debt in Mark's name, a down payment on the Range Rover, and the velvet chairs. They were setting me up as the legal scapegoat for the debt. If the prop house found out the sale was fraudulent, the liability would fall on me because the loan and the forged dissolution had my name on them. I photographed every page with my phone, front and back, and then I put everything back exactly where I found it. I wiped the drawer handle with a dish towel. I also noted that the original partnership agreement was not in the drawer, and that worried me until I remembered it was still hidden in the church basement, 2 miles away under a drop cloth behind the boiler. I also found a shredded document in the office trash can. It had been run through a cross-cut shredder, the kind that turns paper into confetti, but the pieces were no wider than a typewriter ribbon, and I have spent thousands of hours threading ribbons through vibrating arms. My fingers know small strips of paper the way other people's fingers know piano keys. I took the bag of shreds, and while Valerie and Mark were upstairs yelling at the plumber on the phone, I spent an hour by the window with tweezers and scotch tape, reassembling a page from the original partnership agreement. It was the signature page, and my father's notary seal was missing. They had removed that page and tried to destroy it. I taped the pieces to a sheet of printer paper and slid it inside the spine of a large cookbook on their shelf. No one opens a cookbook in a house where no one cooks. On day 11, I called a number I had found in my father's old desk, a bank compliance officer named Laura Delgado at the regional bank where our business account had been opened. I told her my name and gave her the partnership agreement number from the original. She went silent for 10 seconds. Then she said, "Your father called me 6 months before he died. He asked me to attach a verification hold to the business account. Any sale, any dissolution, any draw over $5,000 required both partners to appear in person at the bank with the original notarized agreement." She said she had been waiting for my call. The forged dissolution had triggered the hold, which is why the prop house wire transfer had not fully cleared into Valerie's hands. Some of the money was stuck in an escrow account, frozen, waiting for dual authentication. Laura asked me to bring the original agreement to the bank so she could compare the notary seal and the signature. I did not tell her yet that I had already reassembled the shredded signature page and hidden it in the cookbook. I wanted to see what she would do on her own. She did not disappoint me. She said, "Do not come to the bank wearing anything expensive, do not bring your phone, and do not let anyone know where you are going." I went the next morning, walking the 2 miles to the bank in a plain raincoat. I brought the original in a canvas bag that looked like it held groceries. Inside the bank, Laura met me in the lobby and took me to a private office. She compared the original agreement with the forged dissolution side by side. Then she pulled out a magnifying glass and pointed to the notary seal on the forged document. "That notary died 5 years ago," she said. "I already knew." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Your father told me you would know. The hold was a dead man's switch. It required my physical presence and my voice confirmation, not just a signature. When my father notarized the agreement, he added a clause on page 9 that said any transaction over $5,000 required dual in-person authentication at the bank, with both partners present and a compliance officer on the line. He knew Valerie would forge a signature. He knew she would try to sell. So he locked the funds behind my body, my voice, my actual living presence. I had retrieved the original from the church basement, still wrapped in the drop cloth, and I carried it to the bank inside the plain canvas bag. Laura made 2 copies, sealed the original in a tamper-proof envelope, and placed it in the bank's vault. She also gave me a small USB device, a keylogger, no bigger than my thumbnail. She told me to plug it into the back of Valerie's laptop for 10 seconds. I did it the next morning while Valerie and Mark were arguing about the escrow hold. The keylogger captured her password, Crown Victoria 1928. She had used the name of a typewriter we had restored together. Laura laughed for the first time in weeks. That password let the fraud unit see every transfer, every message, every document. They could trace the Belize account, the forged loan application, the dead notary stamp, and the credit card payments. They had everything they needed except the final piece. That piece was me standing in a bank conference room refusing to sign. I decided to test them. On day 14, I walked into the kitchen where Valerie was signing some papers at the island. I clutched my chest and gasped. I let my knees fold slowly, like a woman having a cardiac event. I slid down the cabinet and lay on the tile floor, one hand splayed, the other pressed to my sternum. The tile was cold and I could feel a crumb under my palm, which meant the floor had not been swept. Valerie looked down at me. Her face did not change. She said, "Where is the original agreement, Lydia?" She stepped over my legs, her heel catching the edge of my sleeve, and reached for a document on the counter. Mark stood in the doorway and said, "Is she faking?" Valerie said, "She is not getting up until I get the signature." I lay there for 90 seconds, listening to the refrigerator hum. No one called 911. No one checked my pulse. No one touched me except to step over me. I finally opened my eyes and sat up. I said, "I think I fainted." Valerie said, "You should see a doctor after we finish the paperwork." That was the moment every last cell of family loyalty in my body died. I had already recorded the entire scene on the voice recorder in my cardigan pocket, and the audio captured the indifference in her voice, the way she said my name, the way she stepped over me. That recording became Exhibit 12 in her fraud trial. She did not know it existed until a prosecutor played it in a sterile room with fluorescent lights. 2 days later, Valerie and Mark drove me to the bank. They said the prop house money was finally ready to be released, but the bank needed me to appear in person to verify my identity. They had a new release form for me to sign. It was a simple document, they said, just a formality. I dressed in my best navy suit, the one I used to wear to court, and I put on the small pearl earrings my mother had left me. I looked like a woman who was about to sign a settlement agreement. Valerie sat in the back seat with me, patting my hand, telling me to just sign and it would all be over. Mark parallel parked the Escalade and killed the engine. Laura Delgado met us in the lobby. She was wearing a badge on a lanyard and carrying a leather portfolio. She led us to a conference room on the second floor. Through the glass walls I could see 2 bank security officers and a man in a grey suit I assumed was a federal agent. The original partnership agreement was already on the table, next to the forged dissolution. Laura said, "Mrs. Harmon, can you confirm for the record whether you signed this dissolution?" I looked at Valerie. Her face was tight, her lipstick fresh, her hands folded on the table like a choir girl. Mark was sweating through his shirt collar. I looked at the forged document. I looked at the original with my father's notary seal and his handwriting in the margin. I said, "I have spent 28 years reading contracts, and I know the difference between a signature and a forgery. I am not signing anything and I am not saving you." That was the line. I had practiced it in the bathroom mirror until it came out calm and flat, like I was reading a bus schedule. Valerie's face went white in stages, like a photograph developing in reverse. Mark started shouting about lawyers, about entrapment, about his rights. Laura pressed a button under the table. The security officers came in. The federal agent stood up and read them their rights. Valerie tried to grab the original agreement off the table, and her own husband said, "Don't touch it, you idiot." They were handcuffed in the conference room while I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on top of my purse, my heart beating like a type key hitting a platen. Valerie was charged with 7 felonies including forgery, identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. Mark was charged with 6. The Ohio Attorney General's office had a file 3 inches thick, and the keylogger data alone filled 200 pages. The prop house sued them for fraud and breach of contract, and the court voided the entire sale. The machines came back to me in a moving truck, still wrapped in moving blankets the way they had left. The client list was restored. The $190,000 in the Belize account was repatriated by the FBI. The bank released the escrow funds to the business after I signed a certification with Laura Delgado. I did not get a $10 million windfall. I got the return of my inventory, my client list, and the $139,000 I had originally invested. That was enough. It was more than enough because it was mine, and I had not sold myself to get it. I reopened the shop under a new name, Carriage of Deceit Typewriters. The sign is forest green with gold lettering, and the front window still catches the afternoon light. I kept the royal by the front window, with a small sign that says the original agreement is in a safe deposit box. Valerie, after her plea deal, got 36 months in the women's correctional facility plus 5 years of supervised release. Mark got 7 years because he had a prior fraud conviction in another state, a fact that did not come out until the federal investigation. As part of her restitution, Valerie had to perform 200 hours of community service. Her probation officer sent her to me. She polishes key levers in a grey smock with "shifted my pension" printed on the back. Every repair ticket has her fraud docket number printed at the bottom, right above the total. She has to initial each ticket. She does not speak. She polishes type levers until they gleam, and sometimes I watch her from across the shop and think about the woman who stepped over my body on the kitchen floor. I do not feel sorry for her. I feel sorry for the version of myself who once believed she could be trusted. My father saw it coming. He was a quiet man who could repair a carriage return with a bent paperclip and a prayer. He knew my half-sister had a talent for self-preservation, and he knew I had a talent for patience. That is why he notarized the original partnership agreement and hid the only true copy inside the hollow base of a typewriter he knew Valerie would throw away. He locked the money behind my physical presence, not my signature. He knew I would be the one to fix the disposal, reassemble the shreds, and read the fine print. He did not leave me a warning in a will. He left me a machine I knew how to take apart. That was the real inheritance. It was not about the money. It was about knowing that someone had seen me clearly, even when I had stopped seeing myself. Integrity is not a family trait. It is a daily choice, and the only people who deserve your loyalty are the ones who never weaponize it. You can share blood with someone and still not share a single value. The family you choose is the family that chooses to show up with a screwdriver and a steady hand, not the family that shows up with a clipboard and a forged signature. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments. If you believe family should not be allowed to forge your name just because they share your blood, hit like and subscribe. I will be here next time with another story about the moment someone learned exactly who had been holding the keys. Until then, keep your originals where no one can reach them, and never sign anything until you have read every line.